Kareem has considerable height on me. We are delighted in the Faculty of Arts to be a co-presenter of the Democracy Exchange. And this afternoon, I have the distinct honor of introducing keynote speaker, Dr. Leah Bassel, who will present what will be an extremely insightful address. Leah is modest. She's very humble, and anyone who knows her would probably agree with that. But she is extremely, at the same time, extremely impressive. Dr. Bassel has traveled throughout Europe. She's conducted research throughout Europe, shared her research findings and her thoughts on migration, race, citizenship, the politics of gender, and the list goes on. After completing a BA, and I won't be reading her CV, but after completing a BA and an MA in political science from McGill University, Dr. Bassel traveled to Paris, where, unlike most academics, she did things such as work as an emergency outreach worker supporting asylum seekers. She also organized a circus camp project, something that has become an annual event for refugee youth. She completed her doctorate in international relations at the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Center, where she was a Commonwealth Scholar. She held a postdoctoral position at Oxford at the Université de Bruxelles, Institute of Sociology in Belgium. I mean, the list goes on and on. She had spent many years lecturing at the University of Leicester's Department of Sociology. That was, I think, 7 years. And Dr. Bassel is now teaching in the Social Sciences Department at the University of Roehampton in London, in the UK. Leah's here to discuss her latest book, The Politics of Listening: Possibilities and Challenges for Democratic Life. And I'm currently reading this book. And I have to tell you, and perhaps this says just as much about the book as it does about myself, I took it on vacation. I was telling Leah this yesterday. I took it on vacation with me. I'm very selective about the reading I'll take when I want to relax and enjoy myself. But I chose this book, and I do a little bit of preliminary reading, and I chose it because it was so accessible and so insightful and provocative, and even though I do research in a different area, it provided me with a lot of inspiration for my own work. So it's a pleasure to welcome, I don't want to use up any of her time, pleasure to welcome Leah Bassel.
Thank you so much. That's a really generous introduction. And thank you to the Faculty of Arts and the conference organizers for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be back in Toronto. It's also really nice to take a bit of a break from Brexit. So I'm extra happy to be back home. I want to start by saying, reflecting a little bit on an issue on something we've been trying to do throughout the conference, which is we've been starting our sessions with acknowledgement of territory. And certainly it would be possible for me to repeat the university's acknowledgement from the website. I think we had a really powerful acknowledgement from the Faculty of Arts at the beginning of the conference. But what I'd like to say about acknowledgements is that I think to say those things without doing the hard work of questioning that needs to go behind our acknowledgement of territory, and without doing some of that personal work that has to underlie that, and that collective work, that's a kind of practice that can end up being a little bit performative, and it can risk a practice of kind of repeating these words, but without doing what Michael Champagne talked to us about, which is then acting on that knowledge and acting on those words and doing something with them. And this is what I'm going to suggest to you can be possible through a politics of listening, is to listen, and to listen in a way that acknowledges that what we hear will require some change for us, from us, and how that can then be connected to our political and our social lives and our individual practices. Because otherwise, this can be what Dr. Hayden King, the director here at Ryerson University of the Yellowhead Institute, suggested earlier this week. These can become kind of alibis where we're not doing that hard work of understanding neighbors and about treaties of the territory and learning about nations that should have jurisdiction. Instead, we're just saying these words. So a politics of listening, I'm going to suggest to you, can require that kind of change from us, the listener, that can translate into that kind of action. And I'm going to talk about this in 3 parts. The first is going to be to tell you a little bit about my story. Pam very kindly told us some of these things already, but how I got to thinking about listening and what I mean by talking about listening as a form of politics. And I'm then second going to say a little bit about why we should do that, why we should undertake a politics of listening and the kind of promise that can hold. And finally, I want to say something about how we do this. And here I hope that this will connect with some of the things we've heard already in the conference and some of the things I know will be coming in the subsequent sessions. I know from what I've already heard her say, speaking about the Philippines, that Maria Ressa's keynote tomorrow will be really powerful. She's really inspirational. And I also know from conversations and sessions I've been part of in the last couple days about the inspirational work of groups like the Logan Square Neighborhood Association. And I don't know where they're sitting. Anissa, Raymond, and Brian, I don't know where you are, but I'm really inspired by the work that they're doing to fight to take rights back in their neighborhood. So I think what we can see here is the possibility to connect listening to politics in a way that doesn't keep us just in the diagnosis, but that offers us some pathways to action and to hope. So first, what is a politics of listening, and how did I get here? And this is something I started thinking about when I was working in France. Pam mentioned this work with, this emergency outreach work with asylum seekers and homeless people. And I had the opportunity to do this work in a number of areas. And a lot of those areas were parts of cities that had been affected by what are referred to as riots and would soon again be affected by riots. And the people that I met, the people I interacted with every day, some of them were young, some were old, some were French, some were non-citizens with a range of legal statuses or lack thereof. They all had these very complicated and intense relationships with the places where they lived, with the social networks around them, and also with the institutions, whether that was police or social services or other formal institutions. And they had very strong ties as well as conflicts with each other. I then came back to these areas as a doctoral researcher. They're referred to in the French policy framework and in the French national imaginary as sensitive urban zones, zones urbaines sensibles. The French love their acronyms. They're the ZUS. And I learned all over again about those really complicated relationships. These stories of tension, of conflict, but also of solidarity and this dynamism people had despite the stigma of living in these areas coming from the French state, from French society. Despite the considerable challenges people were facing, there was that dynamism and that will to try to create something different together. I was also incidentally reassured by French officials at the time that, oh, all that stuff that happened before, it's never going to happen again. And then 2005 came, and I was so upset and angry. There was the difficult and violent nature of the events themselves, the death of 2 young men, Zayed Benna and Bouna Traoré, who were fleeing police in a suburb of Paris. And then there was the violence of the response from the French state and politicians. It was the imposition of a state of emergency, tear gas first, ask questions later, the use of a colonial-era curfew law on French citizens, and the statements by the Interior Minister at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, that these young people living in these housing estates were scum, or racailles, who should be cleaned away with a high-pressure water gun, a Karcher water gun. So what I want to share with you is that feeling of anger, but also this kind of paralysis, that's kind of feeling of powerlessness, and a kind of, well, what can I do about this? And it's not my country. And I just sort of sat there and I watched, and I was really angry. And then when the events of 2011 happened, I was living in London at the time, in Tottenham in North London, when a young black man, Mark Duggan, was shot by police. I felt some of those emotions again, and something changed for me that time, and I stopped saying them, and I started saying we. And fortunately, there were other people around me who also wanted to act. With my colleagues Gurminder Babra and Ipek Demir, we decided to bring together in a symposium with fellow academics, but also other members of different communities, activists, members of the public. And we wanted to engage in a dialogue about what had happened, because just like in France, it wasn't just 2011. This has been happening and happening and happening over decades, and we can actually stretch the timeline much further back. And where to now? So how do we wanted to engage in that dialogue where people could share their energies, share their opinions, and to think about a way forward. And we were talking about this, this came up in the panel on intersectionality earlier, of this idea about getting involved in situations that make you feel uncomfortable. And that was a very uncomfortable process to set that event up and to be part of it. And we know that these are very fraught kind of challenges. How do we construct that kind of space? What should that kind of space look like? Who is it for? On behalf of whom? By whom, and how can we structure that kind of deliberation? And that I think is fairly well-worn terrain in our democratic knowledge. But what I was struck by was more, as I prepared that event and participated in it and other events around those events of 2011, I began to worry more about what I wasn't hearing, about the omissions or the mishearing, about how if you didn't immediately fall over yourself to condemn what were being called by politicians and the media feral youth or failed parents, you were inaudible. Or you immediately had to assure interlocutors, as the leader at the time, Ed Miliband of the Labour Party did, to explain is not to excuse. And this resonated very strongly with previous work I'd done with Muslim women in France and Canada, where, in the words of a Somali woman in Canada who was speaking about the practice of female genital mutilation, "I wish white liberal women would stop saving us. They only listen to you if you bash your culture." What politics of listening, or lack thereof, allows for these kinds of silences or inaudibilities? How does that kind of norm of intelligibility or division, partition of what we can hear and apprehend come about? So that's the project here, and I think it's important to say also that I'm not going to give you a grand theory of listening. I think there are other colleagues who've been working in that kind of vein. That's not what you'll get from me, not least because that can often lead to a kind of lesson giving that I'm not interested in. Instead, this is about exploring the micropolitics of listening as a social and political process that takes place in specific times and places, and the way that can create a responsibility to change roles, to shift who's speaking and who's listening, and the ways that can in turn disrupt relations of power and privilege that we know from what we've been talking about already structure democratic life. This can emerge by thinking about the ways in which speaking and listening are interdependent. And this is something, for instance, the political theorist Susan Bickford does very well. And what does that then look like in different contexts of alienation, of distrust, of conflict, of disaffection from traditional politics? So listening, I'm suggesting, can be a different way of doing politics when listening, speaking, and acting connect in new ways. This may sound really obvious. The first step, and spoiler alert, is to stop talking. It's surprisingly difficult to do. The sociologist Les Back talks about listening as an art, And he makes some really important observations about the ways in which many of our cultural spaces are spaces in which we clamor to be heard. Look at me, listen to me, and how that damages our capacity to listen. We want to gain attention, we want to narrate, and instead, an art of listening, he suggests, should be more a practice of humility. It shouldn't be about charging in and narrating and grabbing the 2011 riots and putting your pet theory on it and fitting all the events around this. It can also be a way of opening up these false absolute categories that we sometimes come across, where one group is, everybody's either really, really good or really, really bad, but nobody is ever actually human. And that an art of listening then can take us in these important steps of humility, of attention to complexity, of humanity rather than absolute moral categories. What I'm adding to that here, though, is the politics, because my task here and my interest is about that artful rendering, but also how we can act here and now in these contexts of conflict and inequality, how we can ensure that those responsibilities actually shift of speaking and listening. So it's really good. The humility, attention to complexity, they're really good. And maybe that makes the case for, I happen to be under the category of sociology now, maybe that makes it a compelling case for my discipline. But what am I asking you, or what am I suggesting to you? Does that mean everybody in this room should become a sociologist? There's only too little space often in these public debates for that kind of complexity. Anybody here who has, for instance, given evidence in highly mediatized or public policy consultations may have had that experience as well. Certainly, I know that was the case for me. The 2011 riots report was a published submission at the Leveson Inquiry into press standards. I've had the opportunity to give evidence at a House of Lords Select Committee in Brexit Britain about what citizenship tests should look like. And I can tell you from those experiences that these more complex stories are very quickly dismissed in those very polarized and narrow scripted types of spaces. And they're especially dismissed when they're coming from the mouths of people who are not considered to be legitimate speakers, who are not recognized as legitimate interlocutors in those spaces for historical reasons, who are not perceived as speaking subjects. So how can we think about listening then in those tense adversarial moments when action has to take place here and now, and when that complexity is really endangered? This is also not a project about what we might call institutionalizing listening. And I think there's a lot of work around, for instance, how governments can be more responsive to citizens' preferences. How listening might provide a kind of what Justine Lloyd calls a managerial cure. Just add some listening and it's like a magic bullet to solve organizational problems. Instead, this is about paying close attention to how power and privilege and relations of domination can sometimes be shaken by the unheard from the bottom up, and what the consequences are when this doesn't happen. So that's what I mean by a politics of listening. The second point I want to make to you and present to you is, well, why should we do this? And what is the point? And there are many plausible reasons here we might think of. The reason I argue for is at the same time very simple and almost impossible. I think this is about political equality. I think that's an intrinsic value. It's a way we can combat some of the forms of misrecognition we've already been talking about, where some people are considered to be abject or less than human, whether that's because of race or gender or class or disability, or the way many of these things and others combine. We started talking earlier today about different democratic traditions we might want to anchor this work around. I know we spoke about ancient Greece and Rome. Certainly, I've been very influenced by this more agonistic tradition. Well, what happens when people don't just wait to be recognized as speaking, but they grab the space and act as people who have something to say and who should be respected, whether or not that's happening on the part of powerful actors. And that can be really powerful in challenging some of those norms, those us, the audible, and them, the stigmatized others. But I think there's another important step to take, and I want to add that by way of entering into dialogue with what some of the previous speakers have said, because we're not coming to the study of listening or to the concepts of democracy that we're working with in our political practice, in our activism. We're not coming to them fully formed, with these concepts fully formed in our pockets. They're just as much a part of these power relations as are the processes that we're studying. So I would suggest instead that maybe there's a need here to think about decolonizing the concept of democracy. When we're talking about Athens, ancient Greece, and Rome, we're always observing that, yeah, but there were also, slave societies, they were misogynistic, the two are actually not mutually exclusive. Well, why should we go there then and root our current democratic practice in those kinds of ideals? And I think when we start to think that way, we come up against some resistance also in the democratic canon. Certainly that's been my experience when I've started to suggest to draw on Black and Indigenous people of color scholarship, intersectionality work, critical race feminism, by way of maybe criticizing some of that agonistic democracy or deliberative democracy. And I've found myself being corrected on my interpretation of the holy texts. And I think that's a really interesting process to reflect on, because that's about the power relations around our knowledge production about democracy and listening. And there are steps we need to take beyond that, so we're not adding those perspectives after we've already entrenched that canon of the myth of ancient Greece and Rome. We start with those perspectives, and we build our democratic practice from there. That's certainly something I've had the opportunity to do in work on the activism of women of color across Europe with my colleague Akugo Emejulu. And what we can see there is that kind of erasure or selective hearing. We were talking also in the intersectionality panel about people being tokens, about some of the women who spoke on the panel talked about being seen only according to certain characteristics that are being underrepresented. And that's a kind of a violence then. It's about, well, we only want you here for this, but can your knowledge and your political understanding and your understanding of democracy be part of this process? We should be starting with that kind of knowledge. That can be a failure then in terms of our theories and our concepts, but also in the politics of listening. When we have those kinds of instances, and those are not separate things, the academic concepts and the practice, they coexist with each other. And that's what happens when the woman I interviewed, the Somali woman, talks about they only listen to you when you bash your culture. And that's what happens when young Black men in 2011 are only remembered when they riot. It's not going to be about some sort of authentic clarity. We're never all going to be completely legible and completely understandable to each other. We have misunderstandings. We're human. But political equality means naming the fact that there are some groups of people who systematically have fewer narrative resources and who are systematically and through processes that are historically entrenched, not able to be recognized as speaking, let alone not having specific claims that they're making heard. And we can attune ourselves differently when we use these different concepts and tools of democracy. For me, that's come out of the scholarship of Black and Indigenous people of color, when we start with some of this activism and some of these concepts that are generated. So I think now we should come to maybe the most important point of all, the third point, which is, well, how would we do this? And how does that happen? Does that actually happen? Is that even out there? Are there these opportunities to create new representations and for people to tell their own stories on their own terms, or at least on terms that are not so radically unequal? There are different ways which in the book I've talked about how this comes together on the ground. I don't want to say too much about Canada because we're at a conference in Canada and many people here are doing work on Canada. I hope that you're going to talk about what's been happening on the west coast of Canada, Wet'suwet'en, because that's something I can only perceive at a great distance through different media platforms. I think some of the promising examples I can see in this context are through, for instance, solidarities and practices of a politics of listening between some migrant justice activists and Indigenous allies, where migrant justice activists, and we see this really clearly in the work of Harsha Walia, have been really incisive in thinking about what it means to campaign for migrant justice when Indigenous sovereignties are centered, and to move away from campaigns for migrant justice that, for example, are claiming or demanding open borders because of the ways in which those kind of claims may perpetuate and continue legacies of colonialism and undermine the struggles of Indigenous allies that she discusses in her work. That doesn't mean that migrant justice allies are adopting the perspective of Indigenous allies, as she's careful to point out as well. This is a project of hearing people on their own terms, but then of acting on what you hear and of reconfiguring migrant justice and the kind of Canada that you're making claims on. I think there's a lot more to say there, but I'd also like to reflect a little bit in more detail about what this has meant in the UK in my work. And here I'm not really speaking from an academic perspective,